I'm recording just so everybody's aware. I just started recording. Okay, so Dr. Callender just emailed me saying she is about to join, so I'm just gonna
Okay.
go ahead and open since we have a few people in the waiting room already.
Oh, okay.
Well, hello, everybody. Good to see everyone now that we have all our speakers and our moderators. Thank you for coming. I want to start with saying good afternoon and welcome to the spring semester's first Africa Initiative event. My name is Mahajar Sarak Abrahan. I go by Mahi. I'm a second year graduate student in the Pan-African Studies program under the African American Studies Department. I'm really excited to be here and I look forward to today's discussion. But before I pass it on to Dr. Smith, let me just say a few words about the Africa Initiative. The Africa Initiative of Syracuse University is a campus-wide project housed in the Department of African American Studies within the College of Arts and Sciences. Its purpose is to focus on Africa as an important site of knowledge by highlighting teaching, research, and publication work by Syracuse University scholars in the arts, humanities, social and natural sciences, mathematics, engineering, and others. The initiative aims to revitalize interest in Africa, which has been on the wane in many institutions of higher learning since the end of the Cold War. In this respect, it is important to note that Syracuse University once had a vibrant African studies program, although notable resources accumulated during its existence, such as the East African collection at Byrd Library, remain. Moving forward from this history, the Africa Initiative is building upon the previous experience while charting new directions, including offering a significant pool of experts specializing in various aspects of this diverse and richly endowed continent. The Africa Initiative's presence in the Department of African American Studies reinforces a critical site where most academic work on Africa at Syracuse University is done and where the continent and the Caribbean are perceived as concomitant parts of the department's Pan-Africanist vision. By providing an alternative vision and platform for constructive discourse on Africa and African peoples, the Africa Initiative is helping alter the dominant perception of Africa as a continent ridden with perpetual crises and despair. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the rest of the discussion, Dr. Daniel Smith. Dr. Smith is the director of the Rene Crown University Honors Program and professor of African American Studies at Syracuse University. Her core research areas include refugee migration and resettlement, reconciliation and reconstruction in post-conflict societies, and disaster response and management. She has presented her work nationally and globally. Her research and writings have been published in scholarly journals, including Journal of Health and Social Policy, Global Public Health, Economic Development Quarterly, and Development and Society. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for being with us, and take it away.
Mahi, thank you so much for your kind introduction. I would like to begin by welcoming the audience. Thank you to all of you for attending, and we look forward to your insight, your comments, and your questions. Please do use the chat to introduce yourselves, say something about yourselves, tell us where you are from, and to post questions and comments for the speakers. So next, I would like to introduce the presenters. Dr. Jeanette S. Jouili is an associate professor of religion at Syracuse University. She specializes in contemporary Islam, Islam in Europe, anthropology of religion, ethics, religious pluralism and secularism, popular culture, race, and gender. She was the 2011 to 2012 fellow at Cornell University's Society for the Humanities. She has also held a postdoctoral position at the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research at Amsterdam University, where she did research on the pious Islamic cultural and artistic scene in France and the UK. In 2007, she received her PhD jointly from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, France, and the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt oder Germany. Dr. Jouili has published in various journals, including Feminist Review, Social Anthropology, and Muslim World. She is currently completing a book manuscript based on the material of her PhD dissertation, provisionally titled Pious Practice and Secular Constraints: Women in the Islamic Revival in France and Germany. Dr. Jouili's research and teaching interests include Islam in Europe, Islamic revivalism, secularism, pluralism, popular culture, moral and aesthetic practices, and gender. Next, I introduce Dr. Amy Callender. Dr. Kallander is a historian of the early modern and modern Middle East and affiliated faculty with women's and gender studies. Her first book, Women, Gender, and the Palace Households in Ottoman Tunisia, published by the University of Texas Press 2013, is a social history of women and the family that governed Tunisia in the 18th and 19th centuries. She is currently at work on a project examining the relationships between women, gender, and citizenship in post-colonial Tunisia, as exemplified through discourses on romantic love and companionate marriage, family planning as a form of development, and the modernization of the family. Her writing on modern Tunisia has appeared in International Journal of Middle East Studies, Middle East Report Online, Arab Media and Society, and Nouri Ghani editor, The Tunisian Revolution, Context, Architects, Prospects, published by Edinburgh University Press 2013. Professor Kallander teaches courses on the Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East, the Arab revolutions, popular culture, women and gender in Middle East history, Palestine and Israel, and gender and race in European colonial empires. She also contributes to the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. Thank you, Professors Kallander and Professor Jouili. Welcome. So this event is more of a discussion with our presenters and with the audience. And I will begin with asking Jeanette and Amy a series of questions. And after your responses, we will continue. So Jeanette and Amy, to begin with, can you describe for us the events that led up to the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions, discussing factors which contributed to revolution and what were the demands of the people?
Amy, how do you want to start? Should I start? I will speak more about Tunisia. I think you speak about Tunisia and Egypt. How do you prefer?
That sounds fine. You want to go ahead? You can start and then I'll fill in after.
Okay, good. So since I guess the Tunisian Revolution started first, I take that credit. Yeah, so what is really important to understand, of course, is when the kind of uprising happens in late 2010, this is not, I mean, it's usually credited to the self-immolation of someone who has pursued his university studies, but was unemployed and worked as a food vendor, and whose stall was confiscated by the municipality and the police, and so he burned himself in frustration of, you know, being really having taken away all his possibilities for a life, and that then triggers the uprisings. But of course, we really have to look at least 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, you know, back to understand really the dynamics in this country. And we have to talk about understanding the the exacerbating neoliberalization of the Tunisian economy. Ben Ali, the ousted president, dead president, was considered the poster child of Arab governance, right? Who very, very, very willingly, cooperated in, all the assignments given by the, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, etc. So neoliberalization that really destroyed, as everywhere else in many other, places, the public services, subsidies, etc. So that's, one thing. And that is important because, of course, Tunisia has never fully recovered from colonial dependence, right? So the kind of trade agreements between France and Tunisia that had been signed, at the day of independence, where Tunisia basically sells its raw material like phosphate for a penny and a cent to France ever since 1956, has never been re-challenged, etc. So there's this whole kind of economic troubles, and then so we have to talk about the economic kind of track, and then the other thing is the political liberties, civil, the kind of clamping down. I mean, Tunisia has always been autocratic since independence, but with the Ben Ali regime, oppression or the repression of political resistance and opposition has been heightened again, and especially after 9/11, after the kind of cover up of security, struggle against terrorism, that has increased dramatically with the excess of policing, the excess of surveillance, police brutality. I mean, all the stuff that you know about. So I mean, all these things have really heightened up to that level, where in 2010, of course, I mean, 2008 was also a whole global kind of economic crisis. Tunisia has also been impacted by, which is very much depending on tourist economy. So, post 9/11, also tourism has gone down. So there's all these kind of factors. But by 2010, this feeling of suffocation, of extreme, like a lot of young people, and I'm not good at numbers, so I never talk about statistics or percentage. I don't know, perhaps Amy's better in that than me, but unemployment is rampant, and not only among uneducated people, but especially like Mohamed Bouazizi, also about people with diploma, young people who have gone to university. And there has been in Tunisia this kind of really overinvestment in education, this belief that education is the path to kind of upward social mobility, and that has not been maintained. So all these factors come together, and by 2010 the tension is already very high. So when Mohamed Bouazizi martyrs himself for Tunisia, that really sparks the how do you say in English, sparks the fire, something like that. So perhaps Amy can continue.
I'll do my best. Similar to Jeanette, I also do most of my research in Tunisia. So as far as follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer questions about both Tunisia and Egypt, but I have much more experience conducting research in Tunisia. If we're going to compare Tunisia and Egypt, the first thing to point out is that there are a lot of structural similarities. When we look at the situation in these two nations, roughly from the period when they became independent from colonial rule in the 1950s until 2010. And that is to say, both Egypt and Tunisia are one-party systems. There's one political party that runs the government from independence up until 2010. Both countries are ostensibly democratic in that they have elections, they have parliaments, and they have constitutions. But in both countries, they're really dominated by a single party. Egypt is a little bit better at allowing other actors to participate on the national political level, especially under Mubarak, so in the 90s and the 2000s. Both regimes are secular and both regimes are Republican. What's also worth pointing out is that even though in the 1960s, Tunisia was very minimally socialist for a very, very brief period of time, the president rejected Marxism and rejected class struggle, but it was socialist for a little bit. Egypt was committed to socialist modernization in the 1950s and 1960s, but by 1970, both Tunisia and Egypt very clearly shifted their economies to a liberal model. And as Jeanette said, they're both very invested in neoliberalism. Both countries took out loans from the IMF and the World Bank and were forced to follow the kinds of detrimental practices of structural adjustment that are notable across the world, right? That have sparked protests everywhere from Greece to Brazil. So the same effects of structural adjustment we see in Egypt and Tunisia. Both countries, especially Tunisia, has always been aligned politically and diplomatically with the United States. Egypt has been since the 1970s. So politically, both of them align with the United States, and this has proved to be a cover for a lot of human rights abuses and authoritarian practices. In the 1960s and 1970s, both the Tunisian and the Egyptian government repressed political dissent by claiming that any opposition was the result of communism. And even though Egypt at the time was essentially socialist, the regime under Gamal Abdel Nasser repressed communists and imprisoned them. The first two leaders after independence in both countries were popular to the extent that they had some popular support. In Egypt, more so than in Tunisia, because the Egyptian government made greater efforts in the 1950s and 1960s towards the equitable redistribution of land and wealth. But by 1970, most of that socialist investment had stopped as Egypt shifted in a much more economically liberal and then neoliberal direction. So political repression in both countries has gotten a nod of approval or a nod and a wink, whether in this earlier period when the early presidents claimed that all opponents were communists, or since the 1980s, both the presidents of Egypt and Tunisia have claimed that all opponents are militant Muslims. And Egypt is a country that's about 90% Muslim. Tunisia is about 98% Muslim. So these are majority Muslim countries where being Muslim has been repressed, right? It's been targeted. Both countries have gone after men because of their beards, and it's usually not because of their political activities. But this falls in line with the American war on terror, the global war on terror. And both Egypt and Tunisia, as Jeanette pointed out, have very close relationships with Europe and have signed a number of trade agreements with Europe that are not only about economic cooperation, but that basically farm out European security measures so that Egypt and Tunisia begin policing Europe's borders. And Dr. Smith, I'm sure you can opine on this later on. A lot of this is about, the quote unquote security questions about migration. And so what ends up happening is Egypt and Tunisia, as well as other countries in Northern Africa, such as Libya, those regimes are supported by Europe when they agree to police migration and to prevent migration into Europe. And in exchange, European rulers turn a blind eye at the human rights abuses and political repressions undertaken by these regimes, right? So we see all of these similarities between Egypt and Tunisia. As Jeanette said, when we're trying to think about what are some of the causes for the uprising that started in Egypt in January of 2011, they're largely about these underlying socio and economic inequalities where the population holds political leaders accountable for those problems. And in Egypt really is demanding greater participation in government, right? There's a push for multi-party democracy, for true representative government, for broader participation in the government. I would say one of the major differences between Tunisia and Egypt comes down to the role of the military. The Egyptian military has played a significant role in Egyptian politics since the 1950s. It is largely behind the scenes in the sense that Egyptian presidents are civilians and are how do I say this in the correct political science language? They're the de facto heads of state and they run the government. They are the heads of government, but they rely very heavily on senior figures within the military. And the Egyptian military also plays an enormous role in the Egyptian economy. It's something that scholars of Egypt have tried to disentangle and quantify, and it is very difficult to quantify because it's so well hidden. So that's one of the major differences between the two is in Egypt, the military plays a role in the government that's often detrimental to democracy, equality, and social justice. And that is another source of protest. And in both countries, people are really fed up with police violence and police repression, especially in Egypt. The repression of the revolution in Egypt was much more violent than it was in Tunisia, not just in terms of raw numbers, but in terms of scale. And I'd say it's the same with Tunisia. We find these stories of the moment that triggers it, but in a sense, these are just convenient reference points, right? So in Egypt, I think it was January 25th, 2011 was a national holiday. And it's supposed to be a holiday where people take the day off in order to celebrate the police. And I think this has this resonates really well with the current situation in the United States. If we think about what a politically charged atmosphere it would be if everybody in the US had a day off to celebrate the police, this became a day of protest for a lot of Egyptians as a critique of police violence. To say, we're not celebrating the police today, we're gonna have a protest. And that was the first day of protest. And this leads to an 18-day sit-in, primarily in the capital city of Cairo, but there are protests throughout the country that leads to the departure of the sitting president, Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak, of course, tried to save face and do things like appoint a vice president, and he appoints somebody who is a known torturer. And the United States initially says, oh, it's great, he appointed a vice president, that's so democratic, right? So we see these stories of the American or European or sort of the Western excuses for regime brutality, because these are regimes that the United States and Europe supports because they do the dirty work that the US and Europe don't want to do. But the underlying causes, again, are about single party rule, the repression of any opposition, the repression of labor movements, the repression of free speech online, socioeconomic inequality, structural adjustment. I'll stop there.
Dr. Smith, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I was just perhaps going on because I didn't talk so much about the demands. I talked more about the causes, and I think, and so some of the things you mentioned already was the critique of really demanding the restraint of police brutality, of certain kind of freedoms, but also really important, what you said, the redistribution of wealth, right? So it's not a coincidence, and I don't remember if I actually said that earlier or not, but all these demonstrations really started in the center, right? In the center of the country in Tunisia, which is like the economically really marginalized centers. And we can talk, in the next, I think the next set of questions will, also further go into that. But the basic claims of the revolution were dignity, because individuals felt that you do not have dignity in this country. Your life doesn't matter. You are treated like worse than a dog would be treated here, right? Bread was an important word of the revolution. Work, because of the absence of job possibilities, and what else? And freedom, of course, right? So these were really the very basic claims, but importantly articulated really by the part of the population most affected by that. And I don't want to take ahead too much for the next questions, but this is really important to keep in mind, these claims, the keywords that came up again and again during these very early demonstrations, and these keywords still come up today.
Yeah, thank you, Jeanette and Amy. Very insightful in providing that framework of the evolving and long history of resistance to political repression, to oppression, to socioeconomic inequities. Before asking additional questions, I want to remind the audience that this is a discussion-based format, so please submit questions to the chat at any time. You don't have to wait until the end of the round of questions. And as you think of questions to submit to the chat, I will ask next, Jeanette and Amy, the resistance was throughout the countries that you are speaking about. So can you talk more about how specific groups of the population at the grassroots level organized popular mobilization? And I'm asking this question because I'm thinking of Mahi's work on political organization of women. And so we know that particular groups of people have specific needs and specific interests. And so can you speak to how these particular groups mobilized to form a unified political movement?
Well, if I can start with this one, that's an excellent question. And I think the short answer is, if we look at both Tunisia and Egypt, and again, I'm a little bit more familiar with all the details in the case of Tunisia, there really are not civil society organizations. And the revolution actually does not produce any sustained grassroots mobilization. And this perhaps explains some of the failures, or I should say the shortcomings, right, of the revolutionary outcomes. So in Tunisia, as Jeanette mentioned, the protests really start in these rural areas of the country. There are parts of the country that are highly neglected by the central government. Industrialization is concentrated heavily in the capital. The tourist sector that's built up after independence is concentrated along the coast. So in terms of all kinds of infrastructure, from the road networks, public health, the education system, the center and the west of Tunisia are largely forgotten, and they're highly marginalized. That's where the protests begin. And it's local communities that come together to support each other, but who don't necessarily have the framework of a grassroots organization. Tunisia has a relatively large labor federation, but it has been run in a very top-down manner. So there are some labor unions that participate in the protests in Tunisia and in Egypt, but in the Tunisian case, the labor federation kind of sanctions the protests after they're very far underway. And some of the local branches are involved, right? So like the teachers union of Gafsa might be protesting, or right, one of these other very small local branches, but they don't get the support from the National Labor Federation until very late in the game, because the Labor Federation is also an ally of the regime. Most civil society organizations in Tunisia are affiliated with the regime. And any opposition groups, whether they're political or the Tunisian Human Rights League or women's groups, they're largely operating underground in a way that means they don't have the organizational structures to mobilize the masses. So what we see happening is this amazing mobilization, not just at the end of 2010, but for months into 2011, where there's Tunisians on the streets and they're trying to create change, and they're asking not only that the president leave, but then they're asking that the ruling party be dismantled, and they're asking for constitutional changes. And it eventually sadly loses a certain amount of momentum because there aren't any structures to keep that movement in place, and because they have accomplished some of their goals, right? So they accomplish some political change. Political parties are legalized. Tunisians have been joking the last few years that if you get 3 people together, they're forming a political party, right? And there's so many political parties, nobody can keep up with what all their platforms are and what all their names are and who they represent. And there's one political party that's powerful in one town and another party somewhere else, and they still don't really have national infrastructure for a lot of the political parties. So there's kind of this fragmentation. In Egypt, it's largely the Muslim Brotherhood that has grassroots support, right? And this is because the Muslim Brotherhood as a political organization has been around. It has been around for about 100 years, but it was largely crushed by Nasser and then recreated in the 1970s in this alliance between sort of this older generation of activists who were interested in an anti-colonial pan-Islamic platform that challenged British colonialism through the language of Islam as a vision of justice. And then they kind of merged with these student activists from the 1960s and 1970s who also see Islam as a path towards social equity and greater dignity. The Muslim Brotherhood under Mubarak is allowed to exist as partially as an opposition and partially as a legal political party. So members of the Muslim Brotherhood are allowed to run for political office as independents, not as members of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And by the time we get to 2010, there are major differences within the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a huge organization. And it's largely some of the younger activists who really push the Muslim Brotherhood to participate in the 2011 protests, and who are quickly adapting to the use of technology and the interests of students and the interests of younger Egyptians. Like they're very astute, they're very engaged, they're a big part of Egyptian society. Like it's a huge organization. So it's really the Muslim Brotherhood that is the one organization that is able to represent grassroots interests in Egypt after 2011, because they have the people, because they have the structures, and because they've been around for decades. They're able to mobilize that experience towards change, towards participation in the democratic means of government. And that process was largely stopped by the military, which is another very entrenched aspect of the Egyptian government. Jeanette?
Yeah, you mentioned already most of the things, really. I mean, I think perhaps what one can add in Tunisia is, what is interesting is this kind of, I don't know if you could say symbiosis, but this kind of several forces. So there is the really just people, young people, especially really young people. You cannot stress this enough, that, as Amy said, very unorganized, just go on the streets, have nothing than their bodies and their slogans, right? And the way they organize is, as you said, with technology. I mean, some called it in Tunisia Facebook Revolution, right? So back in the day, because all the kind of appointments people gave each other were via Facebook, via social media. So that was really the only way to kind of galvanize people and to come together and know what's happening where and who, when the police has attacked who, because of course that was in many cities, in Gasrin and Sidi Bouzid and Gafsa, there were a lot of fights with the police, and the police was extremely violent, right? And in a way, of course, the police violence has succeeded to sustain the mobilization for a couple of weeks and months, right? The role of the Muslim Brothers is interesting, like when we think comparatively, because obviously the political party that is constituted by Muslim Brothers in Tunisia, the Nahda or Renaissance Party, was never allowed to exist pre 2011, and most of its leadership was in exile, right, in France or in England, and the sympathizers of the Muslim Brothers, and that was a huge debate in 2011, 2012. To what extent were these youth Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers, were they actually involved? Initially, even the leaders were very, very quiet, but as soon as, you know, the legitimizing of new parties took place, they came back, right? And all of a sudden, they have a party that is so well organized that, you know, immediately becomes the most powerful, you know, party in the first democratic elections and in the next, and so on until today. So, I mean, that's really interesting to think about, you know, who had the kind of potential to mobilize in a longer term. But in the early moment, really, it's very spontaneous, and one cannot give enough credit really to young people who had no particular, you know, affiliations. And then, of course, this kind of unsettling a whole youth culture. So in Tunisia in specific, rap has become very important, like the kind of soundtrack to the revolution. And, you know, some scholars have kind of overemphasized or idealized that. But it nonetheless, you know, it really gave voice to this discontentment with the political situation already in 2010. And then, you know, continuing to articulate that message.
I'll just add on that there have been some amazing and brilliant organizations that formed in Egypt in the first decade of the century and then after the revolution. Some of them have been human rights groups and NGOs, but there's been a major regime crackdown against all of those organizations over the last 5 to 8 years. There was one group called Mosirin that was a bunch of young Egyptians who said, look, during the weeks of protest, all these people were using their phones to take pictures and to take videos, and they wanted to archive all of those, to collect all of them and use them to create a visual archive of the protests. And they started traveling around Egypt, and they would set up screens and they would play to people in small villages video of the revolution that people hadn't seen because it wasn't being shown on national TV. And some of the footage was making it on some of the Arabic satellite news channels, but not all of it. So they're going to villages where people didn't have cell phones, where people didn't have internet access, or they're, you know, they had cell phones, but they couldn't do streaming on them. And they start playing all of these videos. And they said, you know, people in the audience were saying to them, okay, this is great. Where can I see more? And these activists were saying, okay, here's our URL. Go check us out online. And these people were like, we don't have personal computers. We're in this part of the country where there's no internet cafes. And these activists then started burning DVDs of a lot of the material that they'd collected. And then when they traveled around the country, they would pass out these DVDs to, you know, the discs to people and say, here you go. This is the footage of revolution, right? This is what happened. These are the things that the state media has been covering up. This is what the state media has been lying about, right? So they're being really innovative. There was a feminist group campaigning against sexual harassment that was creating these interactive online maps to try and talk about, again, these sort of social questions. So there has been a lot of really exciting activism, but there's also been a lot of repression, especially since 2013 in Egypt, right? The current Egyptian regime is basically backed by the military, emphasizing security over everything else. And in many ways, a huge disappointment and kind of a reset to pre-2011.
Yeah, I think that's really important to think about this kind of relation between the kind of urban, educated, kind of civil society actors that participated, and then the distinction between kind of the rural and marginalized region. And it was, you know, you see some similar dynamics in Tunisia when the I think there's another someone making noise. There's a similar dynamic when you see, after an initial hesitation, people in the capital, the kind of educated, Francophile, kind of socially progressive, but economically liberal kind of elites, but that's really happening in a much more paternalist manner when they travel like to the regions and say, we support you. But this is very late in coming. And then, of course, afterwards, it's these people and these groups and these associations and organizations that, as Amy said before, were close to the regime, kind of take over a lot of the discourse of the revolution and where do we want to head. And what is interesting at that moment that we see once Ben Ali is ousted and we have the first democratic election, that these elites stress much more personal liberties than economic justice. And we can talk more about that perhaps in the next set of questions, because this is what is accompanying us until today.
Thank you, Jeanette and Amy. Building on what you've just shared, you note that there has been some accomplishment of goals, perhaps particularly regarding political change, increased political representation. However, it seems that you're suggesting that many goals remain unrecognized, and there may even be a reversal of the accomplishment of some goals. So Jeanette, you ended by saying, where do we go from here? And that is the question, what can we expect in the future, and where do we want to go?
Yeah, I think if I can pick up on that, I think really post 2013, this is where the fundamental changes or differences, between the Tunisian case and the Egyptian case we cannot really compare these two anymore. They are completely different situations. In Tunisia now we have actually a kind of nominal, more than a nominal democracy. There are free elections. There is, a certain freedom of expression. At the same time, human rights violations continue through police violence, especially, right? And everything under the helmet of security. So, but the struggle really post 2011, let's say, with the Troika, the first kind of government that is post Ben Ali, is really this huge tension between, on the one hand, very secular, very French-looking elite in Tunis that is extremely concerned with personal liberties, right? So a lot of the civil society efforts there is for, first of all, favoring the repression of the Nahda and the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, because they really feared that, they want to bring us back to whatever they imagine, right? The Middle Ages, that's always the language they use, like going back to the Middle Ages. They fear about the kind of achievements of Tunisia in terms of women's rights, especially under Bourguiba, which were important, and which, Tunisia had the most progressive legislations in terms of women's rights in the Arab world. So these were things that were high on their agenda, which really polarized the political landscape to an extent where there was hardly any possibility for, overarching solidarities between this group and then, let's say, the poorer regions that their claims have not been made in terms of religion, right? But they are not like ideologically secular as the elite in Tunis has. So you see constantly these and a real left wing kind of let's say a real left wing party or organization that says it is agnostic on the question of religion doesn't exist. So it's either you're, like most of those who are kind of sort of going towards the left are outspokenly secular, and in a way that they put themselves in opposition with everyone who has just a little bit of religion in the public sphere, right? So that creates a huge how do you say, like it blocks really this progress towards talking about social justice, economic redistribution, and this is why we see in the last 10 years, and I mean, I think this is really important to see in terms of, if we want to talk about the positive outcomes of the Tunisian Revolution, it's not so much the achievements, apart from, having some sort of democracy and free elections and freedom of opinion, which is important, is really this new culture of people speaking out, of, demonstrating regularly. And it's, again and again, I mean, there have been so many different movements. There have been movements like Oeno Petrol, which means like, where's the oil? Because Tunisia has like a tiny little bit of oil. And, because of corruption, the regions that have never seen anything of that. So, you have these kind of local sporadic, and as Amy said, they don't have the infrastructure to maintain them, but they keep pressure on the government at specific moment. A very important other organization or kind of movement was the Manish Msema, which was a mobilization against a law that wanted to give amnesty to the old regime, which was pushed through nonetheless, which was more an urban educated phenomenon. But we see like throughout, and of course, I don't know if you followed up, but the last month was full of demonstrations and again grassroots mobilization. So we really see a democratic culture where people say we want to hold the state accountable, right? And I think this is something that is, for someone who knows Tunisia pre-2011, and with all the economic problems, with all the poverty, that is harsh, right? And that's the thing, that the neoliberal state has been expanded under the democracy, unfortunately, right? The public services have been, dismantled, have been continuously dismantled in the last 10 years. So I'm not idealizing, but just this climate of people being able to speak out and able to shout in the street, of taking a bus or a taxi and not being scared of a secret service kind of listening to them and denouncing them at the police. I mean, these things are really significant achievements, right? And it shows really the revolutionary and democratic potential of a population with a long breath, actually, of a population that has been, by Westerners, often accused that Arabs can't be democrats. They need authoritarianism to exist, right? So if we look at most of the democratic mobilization happening, it's actually there, interestingly, right? So I think these are really important points to consider. And of course, Egypt is, and Amy will say perhaps more about this now. There's nothing in Egypt, I think, that is, everything has been killed or imprisoned or,
Yeah, there's been a reset to a certain extent in both Tunisia and Egypt, right? So the movements in 2010, 2011 in both countries are about socioeconomic inequality and political freedoms and democratization. They really end up achieving something in regards to democratization and political freedoms, and pretty much nothing in terms of those socioeconomic questions. So in Tunisia, there were some laws passed maybe in the early 2010s, pushing for more jobs to be created in the rural interior, for forms of kind of affirmative action within Tunisia. It's racially homogenous, but forms of affirmative action that would recognize regional disparities. And I'm not sure that any of that has really panned out. Tunisia's locked into economic agreements with Europe that it can't get out of, right? So none of that is going to change. And what ends up happening is these liberal freedoms turn into debates about cultural questions. And as Jeanette said, there are these very militantly secular parties that refuse to acknowledge that religion can be part of modern life and can inform the way people act. And it doesn't mean that they are controlled by religion or lacking in other forms of agency. So this kind of militant secularism that dominates Tunisian politics, and really some of the political parties have been recreations of the former political party. So when we see something parallel happening in Egypt, the regimes prior to 2011 were backed by the military. And now after, so in 2013, the Muslim Brotherhood won elections and was running the government. Mohamed Morsi, who was president at the time, was making constitutional amendments that were not very popular. So there were some protests. Well, the Egyptian military stepped in, crushed all of those protests, massacred hundreds of Egyptians, arrested and imprisoned thousands more, and initially claimed that they were doing it in support of the protesters, but very quickly placed Egypt right back under this form of one-party secular republicanism that has enough to make its European and American allies happy, but in essence is a military government. And the fact that Tunisia is a much smaller country and of less geostrategic significance to the United States actually works in its favor.
Yeah.
Egypt is a major US ally. It's hugely important to the United States that whoever is in the Egyptian government is supportive of the United States and maintains peace deals with Israel and does not support Palestinians. And the regime that has been in place in Egypt since 2013, run by a general from the military, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, he toes that line 100%. So despite all of his violence and the lack of democratization, he's fully supported by the United States.
And I mean, this became, excuse me for just jumping in, but
ahead.
You just remind me of all these things. I mean, this becomes very clear when Mohamed Morsi, the first democratically elected president, is imprisoned. No one speaks out on his behalf.
Mm-hmm.
Human rights activists say, hey, he's mistreated in prison. He doesn't get medical treatment. No one speaks out. He dies in prison. The first democratically elected president of Egypt dies in prison, and no one speaks out. But when Mubarak dies, he gets from all over the world international, politicians coming to his funeral, right? I mean, this just shows so much. And I think the question of secularism is extremely important. I just saw William Robert asking this question. I mean, we cannot underestimate the importance of that question that cannot be really grasped with an American understanding of what is secularism, right? So the way, for example, you see that Mohamed Morsi was villainized and he was like the satire, the caricatures by kind of people close to the regime about him were horrendous, right? You even had people, calling for that it's legitimate to eradicate, basically to kill the entire population of Muslim brotherhoods, right? So there is a visceralness to the secularism that is quite interesting. And I'm not so sure, I don't see the straight connection for Egypt. Perhaps Amy can say more about that. In Tunisia, it's very straightforward, right? It's like the French style secularism. It's the laïcité, which is not about the separation of religion and state, but of the governing of religion by the state, right? The state has the kind of supremacy and says what is legitimate religion and what not. And, as Amy said before, of course, since independence, all the regimes have been very clear in suppressing any kind of political Muslim voice, but also in engineering a new type of Arabic modernity that did not allow for a headscarf, right? That did not allow for long beards. In Tunisia, you could be, as Amy said, imprisoned if your beard, there was a law about like the millimeters or centimeters of the beard, right? And I have people in my family who were affected by that, by that law. So, I mean, it's a very, very strict reglementation of what is legitimate religion and how much religion is allowed to pour into the public sphere. And everyone who does not conform to that is considered not only an Islamist individually, but as breaking this national consensus of what is our society. So his or her existence looking like that infringes on my liberty of being modern. And I think that's really important to understand when you look, for example, at Tunisian, at the Tunisian kind of society, especially in the capital, where there is literally no conversation possible. It's more important, like some people say, like as a joke, for the people there, it's more important that you can eat in public during Ramadan than having access to health for everyone, right? These kind of like, and these are all caricatures, but these are these kind of, contentions, and they are really hindering all the achievements in terms of the kind of demands in terms of social justice, economic justice.
Yeah, I was looking at this question from William Robert also. I mean, normally when I talk about what secularism means in Egypt or Tunisia, I think the place to begin is to really question how secular is the United States in the first place. Where we have the mention of God on our currency and in the Pledge of Allegiance, and politicians talk about God all the time. And, we use a Christian calendar. And many Supreme Court decisions are adjudicating the role of religion in public life. So at the end of the day, I don't really find the United States to be hugely secular as a model of secularism. What it means in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, in one sense, is that they present themselves as secular to an international audience, and that makes authoritarian rulers acceptable in diplomatic contexts, right? For the United States, for France, or the UK, they're happy to befriend dictators who claim to be secular. What that means in practice is usually not of concern to that aspect of the international community. There is more space for the practice of one's religion in Egypt than in Tunisia. There has been more space to be a practicing Muslim. It's still politicized. It's still viewed as an opposition. There are still red lines around that. But wearing a headscarf did not subject women to persecution the way that it did in Tunisia in the 1990s and the early 2000s, right? So secularism, yes, has meant different things in those two contexts. It has often been an excuse for both governments to exclude political parties that center religion in terms of their ethics and values, and to be able to claim that those groups prioritize religion over democracy, and therefore they're inherently undemocratic, and so on and so forth. It's a bunch of nonsense. But yeah, it's very much a broader, I think, sort of sociological and anthropological question of what does it mean for these governments to be secular. I don't know, William, if you want to speak about that more, and maybe we can do a better job of answering that question.
I mean, no, because you've done a really great job. It just seems to me really important, especially given the focus of our session, that if we're going to decolonize the concept of secularism, we need to really be attentive to the specific ways in which it plays out in different contexts, and not just take some, Charles Taylor-esque nonsense and shellac it over these contexts and say that's what secularism looks like. Because as you so eloquently pointed out, Amy, secularism in theory and secularism in practice in these contexts are vastly different. So Does that, I don't know, did that even make any sense?
Yes, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I don't know how it's with Amy, but for me, I often struggle with explaining to students when I try to tell them, if we talk about the Arab world or North Africa, to what extent a secular system is or can be oppressive, or that, there can happen an extreme political oppression in the name of secularism. And, because here, especially when you talk to liberal students, they would think, secular means you're more open, and it's the religious one, like the Republicans and the evangelicals, they are like the oppressive. So it's interesting, as you said, like we really have to think about local dynamics, and of course we have to think about the continuity between colonial rule and post-colonial rule, and the way that a particular kind of relation between religion and state has been installed in a specific place that doesn't stop when that country becomes independent, right? I mean, those elites, the colonized, Fanon talks a lot about that, the colonized elites, right, under colonialism become the colonized post-colonial elites, right? So with the same categories of thinking, the same, ways of analyzing things. So it's extremely important to take into consideration how these things then play out within the scope of an autocratic regime that, is constantly, and Amy stressed this a lot, and it cannot be enough stressed, that is constantly subjected to kind of a international system that wants that country to stay at a certain place and have a certain function, right? And everything becomes justifiable as long as this country does what it's supposed to do, right? So
a lot to think about. There is a question from Bryce, and Bryce, can I ask you to unmute and read your question, please? Okay. I will read the question in the chat. Jeanette and Amy, how much is modernization a result of the Arab Spring Revolution?
So it would be great, Bryce Radlow, if you're still here, if you can elaborate for me.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I was
Okay.
cleaning. I was cleaning something in my I was cleaning something in my kitchen. I'm so sorry.
Awesome. I was just gonna say, for me, modernization is a term that is almost as much in need of unpacking as is secularism. So you want to restate your question and then we can try to answer it.
Yeah, sure. So the modernization and growth of, I guess, women being informed in education, and then obviously the growth of political parties in Tunisia and Egypt. I was wondering how much of that was a consequence of, the Arab Springs event in Africa, because we talked about general progress being made, but I just want to know how that event played a part in it. I'm so sorry for being away, by the way.
Amy, do you want to go ahead?
I mean, I'm not sure how much I can say. The change that we do see, for instance, in Tunisia, as a result of the revolution, is that the demands of Tunisian people in terms of certain political freedoms or political liberties have been acknowledged by the government and by the constitution. They're not entirely respected in practice, as Jeanette pointed out earlier. But Tunisians have been wanting to have multi-party democracy for decades, if not centuries. They were denied the ability to do that by French colonialism for 75 years, and they were denied that ability by two authoritarian presidents. Since then, they have insisted upon a constitution that allows for political participation, and they have that, right? So they have gotten, again, those political gains that they want. there have not been major changes in terms of education, and that's largely because of the neoliberalization of the academy in Tunisia. So, you know, education is not as valuable as it was in the 60s and 70s. It's much more expensive, and it doesn't guarantee people jobs. But that's because of these sort of external economic factors as opposed to anything internal, right? It's a space where we don't see the aspirations and desires of Tunisians or Egyptians being acknowledged. Whereas in some of the political questions in Tunisia, we do see them being able to actualize some of their desires. So I don't know, Bryce, that helps. Jeanette, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's really important when you look at these. I mean, here we have this idea that, you know, modernization is a package, right? So it's, you know, political parties, it's women's rights, it's, you know, all these like things. What is interesting when you look at post-colonial societies is that you can have certain aspects completely disconnected from others, right? So yes, in Tunisia, when Bourguiba comes to power, he has like a very clearly modernist reform kind of agenda, and kind of, you know, like he's usually credited to have liberated Tunisia's women. So, you know, the personal status law is reformulated in favor of, you know, giving women more access to like divorce and, you know, certain kind of rights, inheritance, etc. Right? So you have but as a political subject, she still doesn't have a right along with her male counterparts, because it's an autocracy and, you know, you're not allowed to pose any opposition. So we talk in Tunisia about a certain kind of state feminism that is orchestrated and engineered by the state, where and Amy, of course, you know, has written about that. So, you know, she can talk more about that, but that does not go along with political freedoms, right? And we really need to be very, very careful in, you know, disentangling things that we think go together that do not go together, right? So you can have, as a woman, right for divorce, but it doesn't make you a political subject, right? And you can, and, you know, Bourguiba did a great job. I mean, his, like, in terms of education, I mean, at least this you can credit him, right? Like his education campaign, you know, Tunisia was, I don't know how much percent illiterate by the dawn of independence, not because Tunisians haven't been literate pre-colonialism, but colonialism has closed indigenous school systems, right? So basically has created, and that again, we also have to think about, right? Like a lot of Arabic countries had a very good and, you know, for the time being, you know, in their historical context, had schooling, traditional schooling, and that was completely closed down during colonialism, because you don't want to have too smart people who can write and, you know, claimed things. So education has been very much reduced to a very small colonized elite. And so Bourguiba kind of reverses that, and then does a massive alphabetization program that was successful, right? Because at that time, the kind of idea of a provider state, at least providing these kind of services, was still important until, you know, what Amy said earlier, the 70s, 80s, when, you know, that investment in public services in health and education completely stopped. So.
Amy and Jeanette, you both spoke of close relations between these countries and the US and Western allies, perhaps Egypt more so with the US. Can you talk a little bit more about their relationships with countries in the region and with countries in Africa, and how non-Western countries, what were their responses to revolution and to these ongoing tensions?
I mean, I'm much better at speaking all of this from the perspective of a historian, and saying, you know, Egypt notoriously strove to play a very important role in the non-aligned movement, right? In the movement for Afro-Asian solidarity, by really inserting Arab into that equation, hosting Afro-Asian solidarity conferences and events and supporting liberation movements. Tunisia tried a teeny tiny bit to situate itself within Africa and play a leading role, but never went very far in any of those domains. And the ruling elite have been ideologically oriented towards Europe. I don't think that holds true for all Tunisian people, but the ruling elite has been turned towards the Mediterranean. I would say Dr. Campbell, maybe Mahi, I would love to hear from the two of you, how you would fill in on this question in terms of, you know, have these revolutions been inspirational beyond Egypt, beyond Tunisia, in Sudan, elsewhere in Africa?
Molly, well, let me jump in because I have a question kind of related to this whole topic and the previous question as well. I mean, mainly my question is like, I do not situate my, like, Sudan's uprising, like my work doesn't really refer to it as part of the Arab uprising. So my first question is like, how do you think, I mean, the same year, the same year the self-immolation happened in Tunisia, it also happened, a worker in Ethiopia, same thing had happened, but like almost anywhere in social movement discussions, you don't see that. And so like, my question is, how harmful is it to the people who are like struggling to kind of situate Egypt, Tunisia in the Arab Spring, not to deny that Arab identity, but like, so it's a two-part question. So my first question is, as scholars, like calling it the Arab Spring or situating it in that movement, how much harm does it do to like really conveying the realities on the ground? And my second question would be like race, like, right, Tunisia, Egypt, like one thing in the Sudanese uprising we see is like Sudanese people are confronting race, right? They're confronting Arabism, and even regional differences are also race, right? Different regions are populated by different races, and certain specific regions tend to be considered African, certain tend to be considered Arab. And that is also related to economic differences. It's also related to healthcare and all of that. So I see it, like what I see in Sudanese uprising, what my findings really, it's hopeful, is that they're confronting these issues. Race is being discussed, even in Khartoum, you know, there are chants like "We are Darfur." So we see that. And how much have we seen that in the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions? Can we expect it going forward? And, you know, Dr. Kallander, you mentioned like solidarities between different organizations haven't been forming to the extent they could. And how much does race play a role in that, you know? So
Mahi, that's an excellent question. It's entirely appropriate. I would start off by saying naming is a huge problem. What do we call these movements, right? So there are people who don't want to call it spring because they started in December and January, right? So it has nothing to do with the spring. And the spring has this connotation of like a reawakening, as if all the people there were asleep and had no agentive role in history prior to that. The Tunisian protests at one point were called the Jasmine Revolution because jasmine is a flower that people really like in Tunisia. And Tunisians got really upset. They're like, this is not about flowers. People died, right? And that's disrespectful. So Jeanette mentioned how, oh, they've been called like a Twitter revolution or a social media, and people in Tunisia have rejected that and said, we stood on the streets, our bodies were there, don't deny the role that we played, right? So all of these names are problematic. The Arab Spring or the Arab revolutions are problematic names because they obscure the participation of people who do not self-identify as Arab. If we look at the case of Libya, right? Libya has a pretty significant Amazigh or indigenous or Berber community that participated in the uprisings. In Tunisia, Bourguiba basically forced the Amazigh communities to assimilate. This was something else that was done under his authoritarian rule. The Amazigh are denied any specific identity. It's largely a cultural, linguistic, and also racial minority, right? But the short answer to your question is that no, none of these movements have engaged with questions of race or with questions of racism. And again, Libya is one example of where we see this really carefully, Gaddafi notoriously wanted to present himself as a leader for the entire African continent, and he offered visas to Africans from a lot of different countries to work in Libya. At the beginning of the uprising in Libya, there was racist targeting of anybody with dark skin. And some of them were just darker skinned Libyans, right? And so people who quote unquote looked more African as opposed to quote unquote looking Arab were targeted as supposed allies of Muammar Gaddafi, when many of them were just there working in construction, but they were accused of being mercenaries and supporting the regime in ways that are very racist. But these movements, I don't know, Jeanette, if you have another reading of it, but in most countries where we saw protests, none of them engaged with questions of internalized racism.
I mean, I think the question of race is, in Tunisia at least, it's something that has been brought up after the revolutions, right? So I first of all, I agree with Amy on everything she says about the naming. It's very complicated, and it's always, you know, what do you exclude? And, you know, the spring, of course, the idea of the Arab Spring also kind of comes from this, you know, paradigmatic, I don't know how you call it in English, but the Spring of Prague, like I don't know, I know it in German how it's said, but not in English, but this is how, so I mean, you know, like a European, East European kind of democratic spring. But I think what is interesting, at least for the Tunisian case, and here, you know, I've talked a little bit dismissively about the so far about this kind of pursuit of social liberties, etc., because it has been so much taken up by the elite, by the, you know, kind of urban bourgeois elite, against social, against economic distribution. But of course, this quest for liberty, freedom, equality, dignity had, and this kind of allowing now of identities to come to the forefront, has empowered, for example, in Tunisia, the Black minority, right? So you have since 2010, Black associations, Berber associations, Jewish associations, that so various minority groups kind of struggling for, not just for visibility, but for being part, you know, being acknowledged as members of society, which for the Black minority means also to really fight against, you know, consistent racist discrimination, representation in history books, bring up the question of slavery, which is of course the big elephant in the room, and so on. And a lot of things have been actually done. Like 2 years ago, you have Tunisia had this first anti-race discrimination law where you can, you know, where it's basically forbidden to insult someone on a racist basis. So these kind of things, like small, there's a couple of, you know, new laws that have happened in the last couple of years because of that manifestation, right? So this is really important to mention, and there's a lot of mobilization, very, very good people that that are very articulate this message. And again, it's not something completely new. Also, you know, Bourguiba has not only oppressed the Berbers, but also there has been, after independence, a mobilization of Black Tunisians, and especially the very charismatic Slim Marzouk was an activist for the Black cause, and Bourguiba conveniently put him into an asylum where he, you know, basically stayed until almost the end of his life. So interesting things happen. And it's interesting that you're talking about this, Mahi, about this question of Arab identity. So, you know, there's a lot of ideology conveyed in that term, in its promotion, like under Arab nationalism, of course, very homogenizing, neglecting that an Arab identity could be nothing more than a linguistic cultural identity, right? That could comprise people of different colors and different religions. Arab nationalism had, of course, a very narrow definition of that. We see also today in this kind of new counter movement, certain kind of anti-Arabisms that take up this language as a convenient form to say, it's the Arabs who are like Islam, who are, radical or conservative. We are the Berbers. We are not like that. We are this identity. We are not like that. So it becomes kind of ideologized in new ways for kind of sometimes really for neoliberal identity politics. And what we see in the Tunisian case, while there is a lot of really important work being done by Tunisian Black people, we see, interestingly, the French and the US embassy constantly inviting, certain kind of platforms, conferences around the topic of Black identity, but in a way where it's, disconnected from, a social and economic struggle. Right. So we see that in this, we talk about race and identity in a very kind of non-economist, I call it neoliberal way, but we do not tackle like the structural issues. So it's very complicated, but I think a lot of things are actually happening in the good direction there. At least like it's on the topic, and people kind of start becoming aware, that actually there is racism in Tunisia, which Tunisians would not like to acknowledge.
I'd add into that around questions of identity, there's also a lot of manipulation. And in Egypt, some of the way it has played out is intentional efforts to divide Egyptian Muslims from Egyptian Christians and pit them against each other, right? And we see this more so in many of the Gulf countries where there were uprisings, such as Bahrain, where there's an intentional effort by authoritarian conservative forces to present the protests as somehow only something that concerns one group, right? Whether it's Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims, and to use sectarianism as a way to undermine these revolutionary movements as well. So those politics haven't played out as much in Tunisia, but in the case of Egypt, there have been efforts to undermine the revolution by presenting it as a question of one particular group, right? Or through these sectarian lenses.
Thank you, Jeanette and Amy. And I'll ask the audience, are there any questions that anyone would like to ask or submit to the chat? And I'll scroll through the panel to see if there are any hands raised.
I have one question.
Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
So as people doing this scholar activism work now, and what do kind of threads of solidarity look like? I feel like this panel was one because it helped us better understand the concepts within which people's lives are operating. What are some other threads that that you might share with us, or particular organizations that we just have to know about doing good work?
Amy, do you want to?
You can go ahead. I'll just say, Sarah, thank you. That's an excellent question. Jeanette, do you have suggestions?
I mean, solidarity is large, and I think it's, I cannot talk about like specifics. I just think that, connecting the dots, bringing things in conversation with each other, thinking about, if we talk about police violence in Tunisia, of course, the question of police violence here comes up. And it's not a coincidence that, across North Africa and into the Middle East, there have been demonstrations, last summer, and, I know for Tunisia, it was the first time that you had really Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Tunisia with the BLM sign, etc. Right? That if something, I mean, you see really a sort of understanding of who are the economically suppressed, right? Those who are oppressed by the regimes, by neoliberal security, imperialist states. I mean, put everything in that you can, right? I mean, it's just a fact, right? People are aware of that. And I think there's a lot of energy there. There's a lot of, this feeling of solidarity, this feeling of recognizing yourself in the other's fate, right? The question is, of course, who's stronger, who's having the last word, who's getting away at the end of the day with it, and how can you move from solidarity or expressions of solidarity, the affect of solidarity that is important, but how can you move from there to actual structural change, right? And I mean, the older I get, the less, I don't want to say optimist, but yeah, the more afraid I am that, they always seem to be like 3 steps ahead of us. I don't know, Amy, if you have some more.
Yeah, Amy and Jeanette, again, thank you so much for sharing your research with us, for just providing really complex thoughts to issues that are complicated, and encouraging us to think beyond sort of simplistic notions. Thank you to the audience for your careful listening, for your comments, for your questions. And I would like to ask Professor Campbell at this point if he can provide some closing remarks.
Well, first, Daniel, thank you so much for steering us in the first Africa Initiative outing for the year 2021. And we're taking this discussion at a time when we had an insurrection in the United States of America. Unfortunately, this is happening at the moment when we cannot have what we usually do. This came in the middle of the pandemic, so we cannot really have food like we usually do. But I really want to thank the 2 presenters, Jeanette and Amy, for sharing their research with us, because this has been so rich. This has been so rich, and it has left us with real, very clear challenges in terms of how do we understand social change. I do want to add my thanks to all those who came out to participate in this discussion. I want to especially salute the members of the Africa Initiative who are here. This was not a good time for some of them, but we're happy that you all came out. Jordan and Mahi, we want to really thank you very much for the hard work you've done to put Africa Initiative on the road with Africa Initiative Board and other members. And we have a very good slate of events for this semester. But I needed to say 1 or 2 words of thanks in terms of the discussion. I think Amy has demonstrated by not only her words, but her deeds, that research on issues of social change does not happen in one part of the world and you act very differently in another part of the world. In the work that is done in Syracuse University, most recently in the issues relating to Not Against SU, Amy has demonstrated that these questions are not something that's happening in Egypt or Tunisia, but right here in the United States of America. We cannot take our teaching away from things that are going around. And although Jeanette is new to the campus, I would hope that Jeanette would also begin to join in the platforms that we have in the Africa Initiative. I need to make a few comments on the presentation. Now, the first comment I want to make is the comment that is usually asked: did the revolution in North Africa fail? And the question has been posed in so many different ways in this panel in relationship to the outcomes. It's usually posed in relationship to the outcomes of revolutions of this sort. did the revolution fail? And I want to answer that question in this way. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out in Paris. 10 years after the French Revolution in 1799, we were going through phases of the French Revolution in 1799. So, and the French Revolution did not fully peak until after the counter-revolution and coming the power of Napoleon. So the question is that the 10 years after the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and all over North Africa and the Near East, the questions that impelled the revolution are still very much. And Jeanette raised the fundamental question that was there in the revolution: dignity. And she outlined the demands. And both Amy and Jeanette brought to the forefront the question: have the structural conditions changed in Egypt, Tunisia, or North Africa? If the structural conditions have not changed, then the conditions that gave rise to the revolution have not changed. And so what we're going through, in my mind, is counter-revolution, which is giving the revolutionary forces room for their own development and clarification. So let me mention a few things that we learned in this presentation in that direction. That in terms of social organization, that we had many new forms of social organization that developed in the process of people organizing to call for dignity. But the most outstanding effort that we've seen in Egypt, Tunisia, and all over this part of Africa and West Asia is the role of women. In fact, the revolutionary women have changed the political calculus so that in the discussion today, we have heard the formulation state feminism, which means that the state itself have to give lip service and to buy into ideas about the rights of women. But the political Islam that was supported by imperialism mobilized ideas about the domination of women, so the identification of the freedom of the rights of women is so central. And in fact, it is my view that that revolution is going on in so many different ways, and it's going to change that entire region, especially in places like Egypt. And so I was very, very happy to hear what is going on the ground. And then the innovative and creative ways that youth have been engaging. Now, one of the things we did not discuss in any great detail in this discussion is in every revolution, there's counter-revolution. And the counter-revolution has been there in Egypt. Amy and Jeanette mentioned the interaction between the European bourgeoisie and neoliberalism and the leadership. But on February 17th, 2011, that is, yesterday was 10 years after imperial forces entered Libya. The point about what is going on in these two countries has to do with international counter-revolution for militarism, which is to create a base in Libya to stab the Egyptian revolution in its back, because my argument that I've written, people, is that the Egyptian revolution is actually not over. And that the dangers of this revolution of a country of 100 million persons has so many implications for not only North Africa, but the rest of the world, that it is the counter-revolution is actually more engaged. And that is why the categories that we use to designate the social changes that are going on would be very important. We discussed very important questions of secularism and religion. And I think these are all very rich concepts that makes us and our community much better. Egypt produced some great revolution. Nawal Saadawi, she's still alive in her 80s, is one of the great revolutionary leaders. So the role of women in the revolution in Egypt did not come out of the blue. There are women who have been working in the trenches for decades to try to highlight the issues of how to get rights. But clear that under neoliberalism that you cannot get rights. Then we have great revolutionary leaders like Samir Amin, who have articulated the interrelationship between changes of economic development in Egypt as in the rest of Africa. So these are issues that I think came out very clearly in our discussion today. I just want to thank everyone and to say that we look forward to your participation in the next Africa event, the Africa Initiative event, which will take place on the 27th of February at noon. And I'm sure that Mahi will say a bit more about this, because this event is going to be about the Biden-Harris administration in Africa. We have a great panel to discuss this, and it's going to be at 12 noon that day, because some of our speakers are in South Africa and Ghana and other parts of the world. So please, Amy and Jeanette, do pass the word around about these events of Africa Initiative. So I see Kofi, the co-chair of the Africa Initiative, who is hiding there someplace, but I want to thank everybody for their participation, and over back to you, Mahi.
Thank you, Walimu. I also want to thank you for giving students like Jordan and I the opportunity to organize events like this and preserving spaces like Africa Initiative for such great discussions. Yeah, so the next event is going to be February 27th. I will try and send it out to everyone who has attended this meeting. It's going to be on what the Biden-Harris administration means to Africa and foreign policy in Africa. We have distinguished speakers from different parts, like different expertise, but like including Samar al-Balushi, the former commissioner of the AU. We have Jouili and Dr of the Pan-African Congress Movement. We have Marcel Kitsu from Cornell and Cheryl Hendricks. So it's like a very dynamic group of speakers, and it's kind of structured like a symposium. So we expect great things, hopefully just as great as this discussion was. And feel free to send me emails if anybody and other students in here want to get involved with the Africa Initiative more and want to be involved in organizing discussions or leading discussions more. And thank you again for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mahi, and good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Bye.
Horace. It's good to see you.
Hello.
Hi. I think that was
What did you think,
Yeah,
Jeanette?
thanks again for everyone. I
What
really
did you
enjoyed
think?
it. It was so nice. I liked it. I mean, you know, you all kind of gave me how do you say, accolades where I don't have, because you know I don't research that field, but it's, you know, I'm like, because my research is on Europe, but I'm really very much invested in what's happening. So